everybody. My name is Greg Leperati. I'm Associate Director of Alumni Relations here at Baruch College. Pleasure to have you all here with us this evening. I am Zooming from Queens. Please put in the chat where you're Zooming from. It's great to see our alumni joining us at these events from all over the world. It's been pretty cool, actually, to have alumni joining us from different continents for these events, so that's always fun. Thank you so much again for joining us, and we're really pleased to have Tanuja Ramchal here to be our presenter for today's very interesting topic about how to be authentic in your career without fitting in. A few quick ground rules before we get started. First and foremost, this event will be recorded. It's always the number one question everybody has. This event will be recorded, and we will distribute that recording afterwards. So if you miss anything here or there, don't worry, we will send out the recording. Please mute your microphones during the presentation. Don't want any ambient noises to distract us. If at any point there's a chance to verbally speak a question, we'll ask you to unmute your microphone to do so. But otherwise, please mute your microphones. You can also turn on your cameras if you'd like. It's great to see our audience smiling back at us. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, you can feel free to put those questions into the chat. Tanuja does a great job responding to a lot of questions and comments as they come in throughout the presentation. But if for any reason we miss your comment or question, don't worry, there will be a time at the end to go over a few other questions that are outstanding, which we may have missed. So don't worry if we might miss it at first, because we will have time to get back to it. That being said, I'd like to now introduce Tanuja. We are very glad to have here this evening to present today's topic. Tanuja has more than 15 years of experience working for global corporations and in higher education. She draws on her own experiences and struggles to help professionals own their value. She designs and facilitates workshops that focus on authenticity, career fulfillment, DEI, and human skills for a corporate and higher ed audience. She coaches clients in all aspects of their careers. She also previously worked at the Zicklin Graduate Career Management Center here at Baruch, and she herself is a Baruch alum. So without further ado, I now present Tanuja Ramchal. Take it away, Tanuja.
Thank you so much, Greg, and thank you to all of you for being here. I'm looking in the chat. It seems like there are a lot of people from Brooklyn, the Bronx, so a lot of New Yorkers, Florida. Greg and I were just talking about him being in Orlando. So nice. And yeah, we were expecting others to come in. And as Greg said, this is usually a global audience, which is great to be able to connect in this way. So thank you for that introduction, Greg. So tonight's workshop is on how to be authentic in your career without fitting in. And it's a big topic. We're talking about authenticity, we're talking about career, we're touching on DEI and systems, right? And a lot of time, authenticity is oversimplified. People say, just be yourself. And we don't know what that means, especially when it comes to the career process. It can feel really hard to understand, how can I really be authentic in my career? And that's what we're going to be demystifying or attempting to demystify today, and also unpack why is it so hard to show up authentically in their career, right? So I want to start, as I usually do with these classes, is by asking a question. What are your challenges when it comes to being authentic in your career, or that you've experienced either in the past or currently? What are your challenges in terms of being authentic in your career? So type in the chat. And what is it that drew you to this particular webinar? So Sunny is saying connecting with senior leaders. And Sunny, if you want to elaborate on that as well, like tell us what is it about that makes it challenging? The unconscious bias of coworkers. Coming across as too authentic, Christopher is saying. Afraid that it will be used against you. The challenge is that being able to listen to more perspectives, it's oversharing, Yeah, challenging leadership or other important stakeholders. Yeah, so that can feel unsafe, right? And especially if you're coming from a background where it's not been safe to share in that way, or where it felt unsafe to be yourself, it can feel really hard. So Sunny is saying in terms of having access to those senior leaders and how to show up with them. And a lot of times, because of the hierarchy, we can feel that, we shouldn't talk to senior leaders in a certain way. And this is where we're questioning ourselves and what we're saying. So really great, really great perspectives here, and also insights, lack of psychological safety. And I'm glad that you brought that up, Vanessa, because I'm going to touch on that. And it's also been a huge topic that has been talked about in terms of DEI and why, a lot of environments are not inclusive. Nadina is saying having a certain vocabulary. What do you mean by that, Nadina? I would love for you to elaborate on what that means.
I guess explaining things in a way that makes leaders comfortable, and just a way of going about challenging people. There's a certain way, at least I've been told, that you certain words to use and certain statements to use, which doesn't always come natural to me in my authentic self.
Yeah. And I also want to, note that you said making others feel comfortable. That's not your job to make others feel comfortable. And that's also a lot of times it's what holds us back, because we're also playing to the comfort of other people, that we are not showing up as ourselves. And as Vanessa was saying, that can be because of psychological safety, right? When other people sometimes get uncomfortable, that's when we can be harmed in that process. So thank you all for sharing, and you can continue to share as well in the chat, because this is meant to be an interactive workshop. It's your workshop. I want you to get what you came for. So be sure to ask questions and interact, right? Because that is what's going to make it more useful in terms of what it is that you want out of it. So what are we going to be covering today? We're going to talk about what is authenticity, right? Again, it's a word that's thrown around a lot. And, a lot of times you don't even know what that means anymore. We're going to cover some basic DEI definitions so that we understand the context in which we are framing, authenticity and why it's so hard to be authentic. We're going to talk about the ways in which we censor ourselves, right? This is where we don't show up authentically. This is where we're shrinking to fit into environments, and that could be as a matter of protecting ourselves. We'll also talk about how professionalism standards promote inauthenticity, right? Because especially, I know you're all Baruch alums here, and if you're going into these organizations where they say be professional, and we never ever think like, what does that even mean and how does it affect me? And a lot of times, it can actually cause us to show up in a way that's not authentic, but we believe that that's the way that it should be. And then what is it that you need to do to show up authentically in your career? So Greg introduced me, and obviously, it's all of the highlights of my career and achievements and awards and all of those things. And those things are great. They certainly are a part of who I am. But also what you don't see is the struggles that I've had in my career, in my life, being a woman of color, being an immigrant. And those are things that often, we discount as those things are not important. But also I couldn't be doing this work without those experiences, right? And I want to reintroduce myself. So here's a little piece that, that allows me to share a little bit more about myself, a little bit more authentically, a little bit more vulnerably. So I come from playing in the hot tropical sun in the day and gathering to listen stories at night. I come from eating ripe, juicy mangoes directly from the tree. I come from a family of teachers who value education. I come from a love of cooking without recipes and being creative and messy. I come from feeling lost in a new country as an immigrant and in a career I chose out of fear. I come from the diversity of Queens and riding the F train. I come from public education all the way to an MBA. I come from valuing the lessons of my own struggles and using those lessons to help others. And this is what I help my clients to do, to have the career that they want by showing up as themselves without censoring and without fitting in. And if that's something that you're interested in, I'll talk about it at the end as well. But we'll go into talking about what it really means to be authentic. And I also want you to notice as I reintroduce myself this way, what was different, right? In terms of the previous slide, where it was like, I got an MBA, here are the number of years I worked in the corporate world, here are my achievements, here are the awards that I've won, and versus this, right? And also notice like what are parts of you that when you introduce yourself or when you talk about yourself that you might not be talking about, that's also really valuable. So what is authenticity? Authenticity is how you operate when you feel safe and free to be yourself. So ask yourself this question: how would you show up differently if you felt safe and free to be yourself? How would you show up in your career if you felt safe and free to be yourself? Authenticity is allowing yourself to be human. This means that you can be messy, you can make mistakes, you can fail, right? Because this is what human beings do. And if you're not allowing yourself to be these things, it means that you can't show up authentically. It means embracing your diversity of experiences and emotions, right? To allow for those experiences to exist and to allow for emotions to exist. A lot of times we categorize emotions as positive or negative. I don't believe emotions are positive or negative. I believe there can be uncomfortable or, uncomfortable or comfortable. And there are certain emotions like happiness and joy that we say, okay, so these are emotions that we want. But when it comes to like fear or anger or sadness, we say those are not emotions, those are negative emotions. But in fact, those emotions serve a very important purpose in our lives, right? So allowing yourself to have those feelings and for those emotions to exist, because that's also what makes you human. That's what separates you from a robot, for example. Authenticity also means that you're connecting genuinely and contextually with others, right? So contextually means that you're not going to go to, the hospital and relate to them the same way you're going to relate to somebody you meet at a party, right? Or you're not going to relate to somebody that, that you barely know the same way you would with a friend that you've known for a long time and have a deep relationship with, right? So connecting genuinely, and it has to be in context. And authenticity is also being honest about what you want, being honest about, what's right for you. It's not just going through the motions and doing things. And this is a very unconscious way of being. And unfortunately, in the career process, a lot of people just do what they believe they're supposed to do without connecting with what's right for them. It's also making career decisions intentionally based on trusting yourself, right? And again, this is if you felt safe and free to be yourself, what is it that you would do? And what is it that you're afraid of if you were to do that? And authenticity is when you feel like you're thriving, right? Not just surviving. So the way I like to explain this in terms of thriving and surviving is, imagine I take an avocado seed, say it's summer, and I plant this avocado seed in New York, right? And the avocado seed might grow for a bit in the summer, but once the harsh winter comes in, right, it started getting cold, that avocado seed is not going to grow to a full-blown tree, right? It's not going to bear fruits. And you can see it in an environment where it's struggling to survive. So the options are either struggle to survive or die. Those are the options of the avocado seed. You take that same avocado seed and you plant it somewhere in Mexico where avocado plants grow, avocado trees grow, right? And you plant it there, and what's going to happen is that avocado tree is going to thrive. It's going to bear fruits. It's going to flourish, right? And that's the difference between surviving and thriving, right? Surviving is where you're in spaces where you feel that you can be yourself. So the options are between, survive or die. or if you're in a space where you get to be fully yourself, this is where, you get to really flourish. You get to feel like you're making an impact. You get to feel like you can be yourself. And how many of you feel that you have this right now? So you can type in the chat. How many of you feel that you are able to be authentic? And Sunny, I'm seeing your comment in terms of the intro. Yeah, so Sunny is saying, I cannot be authentic in my role. Only sometimes, somewhat, but not fully. Yeah, I don't feel like I can be authentic sometimes, most of the time, partially. Rarely. Same, not fully, sometimes. Not really. And I just want to take a moment to acknowledge all of your comments and just to feel what that feels like, that, whether it's sometimes, whether it's rarely, whether it's mostly, whatever it is, like how that feels in your body. Could not. It's change with staff turnover. Sometimes you want to say something you cannot. And just notice. Sometimes we are judged before we even speak. And I totally feel that. I totally understand that as well. I can relate to all of what you're saying. In terms of sometimes just being in environments where it doesn't feel safe to do that. Sometimes people feel that it's politically incorrect, this or that. It's a bit difficult when you are held to certain standards. Yeah, and what are those standards? We'll also talk about that, right? And thank you for sharing, because this is something very vulnerable in terms of acknowledging. And for many people, they feel this way, but it's also not something we have these conversations on. So I also want to let you know, this is a space where we can talk about this. And again, when we're seeing, other people who have the same challenges that we have, we don't feel so alone. Because a lot of times if we think it's, it's very easy to think there's something wrong with me, that I feel, that I can't be myself. But I can assure you that the problem is not you. So authenticity doesn't mean that it's always comfortable or feels good. A lot of people think that authenticity should be the easiest thing in the world. But when you're operating based on certain norms, when you're operating based on systems in place, it can feel very courageous to be authentic. And authenticity shouldn't take courage, right? It should be like where we just show up and we're ourselves. But when you're operating based on standards of systems and those norms, it can feel uncomfortable. And one of the things that I want to, and if you came to the career reinvention workshop in January, I talked a lot about this. It's like to start to normalize feeling uncomfortable, like not just make it, across the board, I feel uncomfortable, so I shouldn't do this thing. It's how we start to normalize discomfort as a way of, okay, so if this thing actually is allowing me to be more of myself, if this thing is allowing me to expand as a human, then it's something that I move towards rather than just avoid all discomfort. Authenticity doesn't mean you do whatever you feel like, right? It doesn't mean that you walk into work 5 hours late. It doesn't mean that you tell people whatever you want to tell them, right? If that's coming from a place of trauma and where you're just, not communicating based on what you feel, but if you're calling people names, for example, that's not being authentic at all. So it doesn't mean that you do whatever you feel like, especially if, if you're doing it from a place of harming people and believing that's authentic. It's actually not authentic. That's usually coming from a place of where you're being triggered, and that's where you're interacting with them from. Authenticity certainly does not mean that you're liked by everyone. And this is something that a lot of people, especially when they're looking for validation from the outside, this can feel very scary, right? Because it doesn't mean that you're going to show up as yourself and everybody is going to like you. In fact, the benefit of authenticity is that you're going to show up as yourself, and the people who don't resonate with that are going to weed themselves out. And that's a good thing, right? Authenticity doesn't mean that you show up the same with everyone. It doesn't mean that you're going to tell the person that you just met everything about your life and the same things that you tell your friend that you had, a strong relationship with. That's not authenticity. There's a big difference between privacy and secrecy. So privacy is where I share based on what the context wants, requires. So I'm not going to share intimate details of my life with everyone. I get to choose. But secrecy is if you're just trying to hide parts of you just because you're scared, that's where you need to start to examine, like, why is it that I'm afraid to bring those parts of me to conversations. I've had clients, for example, who, they came from another country where it was not acceptable to be LGBTQ+. And they would show up in spaces and they were hiding these parts of themselves. And, they felt that there was something wrong with them when it was never them. So that's where it's like you're hiding your, that secrecy, right? And it's by allowing those parts of yourself to come out, that's when you can feel safe and free to be yourself. But if you're in an environment where that's not possible, then that it's going to feel like, that it's not safe to be authentic. Authenticity also does not mean that you're just consistent and you think the same way. Like if you get new information today that you can't change your mind, it means that you can actually change your mind. You can, based on, new perspectives, based on the way you're seeing the world, based on, different things, you can certainly change your mind. You can decide today, hey, I want a career working on Wall Street. And tomorrow you can decide, actually, that's not right for me. What I really want to do is to move into marketing in a nonprofit. So you can certainly change your mind. Authenticity doesn't mean that you're a static being. Again, like you're not a robot, right? You're a human. And the whole point of authenticity is for you to own that humanness, right? It's to accept yourself as a human fully. And, the human experience, as I said before, it's a messy one. And that means accepting that fully, that not to try to be this perfect, person who doesn't make mistakes, who doesn't mess up, who doesn't change their mind, all of that, because that's where you're going to start to feel that, that it's not really safe to be yourself if you're doing that. So dehumanizing systems and norms cause people to show up inauthentically in their career as a matter of survival. Right? And dehumanizing, as the word suggests, means that you can't fully be human, right? And it means that you have to be something other than you are. And what it means is that there's going to be great fear and resistance to showing up authentically in your career when it doesn't feel safe to do so. And this is especially when we've been conditioned to believe career is about survival, right? When we've been dependent on that job to pay the bills, for health insurance, all of those things. And if we lose that, then, it feels like our survival is at risk. And the options are basically survive or die. It's also a belief where we look at security and freedom as two separate things. And what we end up doing is that we trade our freedom for security. Right. And that's when a lot of people say, oh, I feel trapped in my career. Right. And what we're doing is that we're basically saying the security is the familiarity of this job. And anytime we're giving up our freedom, it means that we're oppressing ourselves. Right. And to be or not to be authentic in your career, that's a decision that you get to make. Right. And it depends on what your goal is. Do you want privilege? Or do you want freedom, right? So I would have my clients say to me often is that, I checked all the boxes and I did everything that I was supposed to do. And I feel trapped in my career. I still am not happy. I don't, I was expecting to feel successful and I don't. And let's unpack these two things. So privilege is where you get benefits and immunity based on how closely you align with the standards of the system, right? So say, for example, if we're talking about the patriarchy, how closely do you align with the standards of the patriarchal system, right? And it becomes about survival of the fittest. And I put fittest in quotes because fittest means, are you fitting in? Or are you somebody who is not matching those standards? Because the closer you are to what the standards are, the more privilege that you are going to have. So the more you fit in, the more privilege you are going to have. And this is where people start changing themselves, right? And they present themselves in a different way, and they show up in a different way so that they're getting those benefits of the system. But also that's where they're discarding vital parts of their identity, and that's where they feel like they can't be authentic. It's also operating based on fear, because if you're operating, and if you ever find yourself being afraid of rejection, or you're afraid of failure, or you're afraid of the unknown, chances are you're operating based on a model of privilege, right? And you're playing not to lose. So playing not to lose means you're trying to avoid a bad outcome. And this is when you're basically in survival mode, where it means that if you're not surviving, you're dying, right? Versus playing to win, which is when you're moving towards what it is that you really want, what is right for you. And when we're trying to fit in and everybody else is trying to fit in, there's going to be a lot of competition. And this is where it can feel like crabs in a barrel, and it's a dog-eat-dog world, right? Because there's so many people who are trying to fit into those standards. And this is where we become complicit in terms of perpetuating the status quo and perpetuating those dehumanizing standards, right? Because often what we're doing is trading our freedom for perceived security. And again, anytime you're giving up your freedom, that's oppression, right? And it's also where you look to the outside to tell you what's right or wrong, what's good or bad, what's acceptable or unacceptable. And when we think a lot of times, when I think about it in the career process, I have people tell me, tell me what is it that I should say at a networking event? I want to say the right thing. Or how should I answer this interview question so I say the right thing? And I don't want to be wrong. But anytime you're looking for, what's right or wrong, from the outside, it means that you're basing that on the standards of a system versus trusting yourself, because you're not trusting yourself to do what's right for you, and you're relying on those standards to tell you what to do, when those standards are actually the problem that actually prevent you from being authentic. So let's talk about what it means to have freedom in your career, right? If your goal is to be free in your career, this means to show up fully as yourself. It means that you're giving yourself permission to be human. And this sounds, again, so easy, but it can feel like one of the hardest things that in the world, right? It's giving yourself permission to mess up, giving yourself permission to fail, giving yourself permission to say the quote unquote wrong thing, right? It also, I'm going to stop for a second to just look at what's in the chat. Okay, so Sony's sharing her LinkedIn. And it also means that you're operating based on trusting yourself. And this is all what confidence is. Confidence is that I trust myself, right? And you're playing to win, making decisions that's going to move you towards what is it that you want, not away from what it is that you don't want. Because moving away from what you don't want is not going to get you what you want. Moving towards what you want is going to get you what you want, right? You also know that there's nothing wrong with you, because a lot of times when we're operating based on these dehumanizing standards, we think that the problem is us, right? There's something wrong with me. And what we end up doing is trying to fix ourselves. We can, take program after program, or we can try to, go to therapy, and we are trying to fix ourselves when the problem was never you, right? And it's also where you, rather than worrying about competition, you're able to differentiate yourself, not just based on your achievements and based on the certificates and degrees that you have, but also based on your personal story, your struggles, your challenges. Because a lot of times, when we're operating in these dehumanizing systems, what they tell us make us valuable are the degrees and the certificates and the awards and all of these things, when in fact, the reason that you can also provide value to someone is because of your lived experiences, right? For example, as an immigrant, as a woman of color, the perspective that I bring provide a lot of value to people, and I don't discard that as unimportant or make my degrees more important than that, right? And that's how I can differentiate myself, even in terms of the work that I do, and not just have the same perspective in terms of the way that we should have, our career should go, based on what everybody else is saying, or people who are not just questioning that, but also perpetuating systems, right? Because of those lived experiences. It also means taking responsibility for your own needs. So this is a big one, right? Because freedom means that you're not outsourcing that responsibility to an organization anymore, right? Because you also want to recognize, a lot of times what we do is that we enter into these contracts, and it's unwritten contracts with organizations which they never agree to say, okay, so I'm going to actually come work for you. Now you're going to take care of my needs. And they never agree to that. An organization does not exist to meet your needs. So say, for example, I'm working at Baruch College. Baruch College never agreed to meet my needs. They agreed to pay me, they give me a paycheck. And this is what, they do in terms of me providing value to them. But they never entered agreement to say, hey, Tanuja, I'm going to meet your needs, right? And it's my responsibility to meet my needs. And it means that I can actually bring value to many different organizations and individuals. And that's how I take care of myself, because of the value that I'm bringing to them, not because of the, the money that they're giving me. The value is actually in what it is that I'm providing to them. So freedom is showing up from that space of responsibility as well, in terms of what you're bringing. So I know I've shared a lot so far. I just want to take a pause and see if there's anything coming up for you so far. Is this resonating with you? Do you identify with any of this? Do you see yourself in whether it's having a goal of privilege or having a goal of freedom? Just notice what's coming up.
Tanuja, I am an alum. I don't think these two, are necessarily mutually exclusive. It's very easy to think, in terms of the privilege, you think people will pretend to fit in. Actually, that may not be true. They may completely be authentic. Right. And when we say being authentic at work and have freedom, it never means that everybody, if have bad behavior, they should bring it to work. Right. It's never that. Right. So, so if they feel they have to, if somebody feels they have to, I'm speaking generally, I'm in the financial industry, although I'm in transition. I think this topic is not only pertains to D&I senior executives, it pertains to all the leaders in a company, right? Because we work with people all the time, even though I'm still in transition. If they ever feel they cannot bring themselves to the true self or authentic self to this specific workplace, then maybe that's not the place. You see what I mean? I never felt that way. I felt a little bit at some places. That's why I'm no longer with certain companies, right? Does that make sense?
No, it absolutely makes sense. It's absolutely about the environment. Can you pause 1 second? Let me just finish my, So it's basically about the environment. So if you're in an environment where you feel that you can be yourself, that's perfectly, that's perfectly all right. But you know yourself best as well. Like, if an environment doesn't feel right for you, that then this is not, a place, as opposed to trying to change the environment, as opposed to the avocado seed, trying to make that environment into something that it's not. It's where if it plants itself in an environment that allows it to flourish, that's when it gets to be itself. So absolutely, in terms of if you feel an environment is not right for you, that's when you use your agency, and that's freedom.
Yes, and I care to know there are several people who
Your
said
audio seems to be going in and out. Like it's fading.
I'm not fading.
That's better. Okay.
I'm absolutely not fading. For the people, there are several people who said they could only be partially authentic. We can wait until the end of this presentation. I care to know what they were thinking in terms of they didn't feel that they can bring authentic self to work. But I can wait until.
Yeah, and I would also say everybody's feelings and what they're saying, it's valid. So it's based on their own experiences. So if somebody says that they don't feel authentic, I am not going to question that, because that's what they're feeling. And that's a very valid thing that they've experienced in their workplace.
To some places you mentioned in terms of changing, you cannot change that. That part I want to say I have an opinion, but I can pause that for the time being. Companies are always changing for the better. Or the better companies, they always want to change. In fact, the people who thought that those things could not change, they're all no longer with the firm. There is a reason, because they're the wrong ones for the firm, to be honest.
Absolutely. And that's where people have the freedom to stay in an organization, or they can leave. So for
it's not they can leave. It's not they can leave. They're not good for the companies. They should be fired. Okay.
Okay. So I'm not going to get into that discussion right now, because we do have to move on, and I can determine who should be fired and who shouldn't be fired.
That's some of the people who are no longer with the companies precisely because they said the wrong thing. They do all the wrong thing to other people. They lost great people. That's why they're fired. Not me.
I think in the interest of time, I'd like to move on to another question we got in the chat, which asks about what is the best way to reinvent yourself with a career change? And I'm just curious to know, Tanuja, how authenticity impacts reinvention as far as career changes.
Yeah, so we had a whole workshop on this in January, in terms of, when you're looking to make a change in your career, are you doing that very consciously, or are you doing that unconsciously? So how does authenticity influence that? If you're doing it very unconsciously, is where, you might be in a job that, okay, so this job is not right for me and I want to get out, right? I want to get out of this job. So this is where, I said you can either move away from what you don't want, or you can move towards what it is that you do want. So in terms of authenticity, rather than, just saying that I want to get out of this job, you also want to start to get clear about what is it that's right for you. What is it that works for you in terms of, your values, your vision? If I felt safe and free to be myself, what would be the career that I choose, right? And that's where you get to decide, the direction that you're moving towards, versus just moving away from something bad, or moving, like the avocado seeds say, okay, so I'm going to move out from New York and I'm going to go to Alaska, I'm moving away from, and there's this place called Alaska. Well, that's not a great move, right? Versus making the decision to move to an environment that's right for it. So coming back to that question is very important. Like, if I felt safe and free to be myself and I trusted myself, what is it that I would do, so that you're moving in that direction? And I see I'm just going to look at the chat. Yeah, so not the privilege based on standard system, a privilege they've created from being authentic, right? And there is privilege to being authentic, right? In terms of how you're showing up, and that even that freedom is a privilege. So thank you for sharing that, Paul. So when I say privilege here, what I'm meaning is privilege, and I have it in the definition, benefits in the community based on how closely you align to the standards of the system, right? So I just want to make that clear. And then I just wanted to share this wheel with you in terms of the wheel of power and privilege. And we're not going to go into any kind of great discussion about it, but we can see, like, power is centered in, whether you're a cisgender man, whether you speak English, whether you're rich, whether you own property, whether you're white, whether you have a post-secondary education, and as we go out towards the, in the wheel, that's where it becomes, that's where the marginalization happens. So seeing that the closer you are to the center, the more power you have, the more privilege you have. And that's what I was referring to when I said privilege earlier. And also to recognize that there's an intersectionality of all of these, different race, ethnicity, gender, class, language, religion. So we all have privileges, and we all have marginalization, right? So to recognize that you can, there might be one way that you're identifying that gives you more power in society, but there are other ways that actually, cause you to be marginalized depending on the system. So acknowledging that everyone has their own unique experiences based on discrimination, privilege, and all of that.
Tanuja, we had a request in the chat if we could go back to the last slide for a moment. There was a lot to take in.
Oh, yes, yes.
In the meantime, Tanuja, there was a question in the chat as well about what are the best ways to understand and learn a work culture when you are looking for a new career?
Yeah, so I wouldn't wait just for the interview to learn about this. Certainly talk to people if you can who have worked there in the past. And LinkedIn is a great resource for that. And certainly if Baruch alums, for example, have worked there in the past, I would say connect with them and have that conversation because you already have something in common. If there are people currently working there, you can talk to them as well and asking them very specific questions in terms of what do you like best about this organization? What do you like least about this organization? Say, for example, inclusion is important to you, ask about that. So I would say talk to people who have left the organization would be a great place to start because they would, I believe they would be more open in terms of being more honest. But if you can also talk to people in the organization currently, and then in the interview, not being afraid to ask the questions that you want to know answers to, right? Because then you get to see, that honest, you get to see based on the answers that they give you, especially if you're not interviewing with one person, you're interviewing with multiple people, that you can get different, their take on it as well. And also, if you're doing an in-person interview, for example, I always tell people just when you're sitting there waiting for the interviewer to come meet you, observe like how do people interact? Do they say hello to you? Do they just pass you? How do they interact with each other? So there are many different ways, and also like Glassdoor, for example, is Glassdoor is a very it's a great resource in terms of getting that feedback, where you can go and see what past employees have said. And Janet is saying that this slide is very eye-opening. Yes, Vanessa, the recording will be shared. You'll get it. And here's where all of the intersectionality happened. So even though someone may be white, being a woman, they face that there's that marginalization, right? Or there may be a white man who is gay, there's that marginalization. So, we all have various ways that we are, we are marginalized and we are privileged. So let's talk about some basic definitions, basic definitions in terms of DEI. Diversity. Diversity is the presence of differences. That's all it is, right? Diversity is a fact of life. It's just a fact of life. Life is, when we look at humans, diverse, but when we look at our own experiences, it's diverse. And it means that you have to, to recognize that in terms of, that you're not a one-dimensional object, right? And diversity just doesn't mean race and sex and, and gender. It's so many different things, right? It could be the color of your eyes. It could be how you walk. It could be so many different things, right? In terms of diversity. And it's so many different shades, right? So so when we think of diversity, simply it's the presence of differences. And as humans in ourselves, we are very diverse, right? And that's something that we want to acknowledge, our own diversity. Representation. This is especially in organizations. Representation means making a conscious effort to ensure that differences are reflected in opinions, participation, leadership, decision-making, right? And I just want to underline the term conscious. Like when you're sitting in a room at work, do you say like, whose voice is not being represented here, right? And this is where you want to be very intentional in terms of ensuring that, you know, in the room that there's representation. But it goes a little further than that when we talk about inclusion. And inclusion is a state of differences being accepted, valued, respected, and supported. So inclusion is a state of differences being accepted, valued, respected, and supported. Inclusion does not naturally result from diversity, right? So not because an organization is diverse means it's inclusive. I just want to because this is, a lot of people think diverse means inclusion. It does not. Diversity does not mean inclusion. Inclusion does not naturally result from diversity. Inclusion requires being conscious and intentional. It means that an organization has to do something. It has to go a step further. And what is it that it has to do? It has to ensure that its environment can actually hold everyone. It's not just about fitting in, because a lot of times, you know, and this is very, this is something that advice that's given often in the interview process, is make sure that you're fitting into what it is that they want. And that's very harmful, right? Because that is where you have to reduce yourself and discard parts of yourself in order to fit in. But think of an organization's culture as one where it can stretch to fit everyone, right? It's like where you can come into that organization and you can flourish as yourself. That is what it means to be inclusive, right? To have an environment or an organization culture that's inclusive. It doesn't mean that, you know, I bring in people, you know, from various backgrounds and then they have to fit into certain standards. That's not an inclusive environment. And it means that you're including everyone in this space. And the act of inclusion is not always comfortable.
Yeah, Tanuja, I just wanted to.
I'm going to ask you to raise your hands if you want to speak, because we do have a lot to cover. So if you can just hold off.
I'll wait until the end. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So dehumanizing systems and career norms censor the diversity of humans, right? They're not inclusive because we're shamed and punished for showing up in our full humanness, right? And there's the promise of safety and security by giving up that freedom to be yourself. So when I say freedom, it's the freedom to be yourself and to fit in, right? And this is where fit becomes so harmful, because fit means that you have to closely match the standards of the system, and it harms everyone because these systems are dehumanizing, right? It means that you're not free and safe to be a human. And it's also where the onus is placed on the individual to fix themselves, right? When the environment is the problem. So the individual, in order to, you know, get into a certain organization, you know, they feel that they have to change who they are and, you know, speak a certain way and dress a certain way and act a certain way and not say certain things in order to get a job in whether it's a field or in an organization. I've had clients tell me that they've had to hide the fact or they've been advised to hide the fact that they were gay on their resume because an organization would not hire them, where they've, they actually had an affiliation with an organization and they had it on their resume, and someone told them, remove this from your resume because you're not going to get hired. I've had clients tell me that they've been advised to change their name to a more American sounding name because people are not going to, organizations are not going to take them seriously. I've had Black clients tell me that, they didn't feel safe wearing their hair a certain way because then it wouldn't be seen as professional, right? I've had somebody with dreadlocks tell me that they didn't feel safe to be themselves, wearing dreadlocks in terms of interviews and even networking. So that's where it becomes dehumanizing, when these standards are basically saying that you can't be who you are. And what do socially acceptable ways of self-censorship look like in the career process? It looks like perfectionism. It looks like where you're not allowing yourself to make mistakes, right? And this becomes the internalized oppression, where we're putting this on ourselves and we're saying that I can't mess up. And for a lot of people, what happens in terms of perfectionism, because it's impossible for a human to be perfect, right, is that they're not moving towards what it is that they want. It also means the suppression of negative emotions. Like in a lot of environments, we know in terms of work and professional environments, certain emotions are not acceptable. Anger, for example, is not an acceptable emotion. And for people, if there's something coming up where there's an injustice and they speak up, that can actually end up costing them their jobs. A lack of boundaries, where we're in people-pleasing mode and we're saying yes when we really want to say no, when there are other priorities. Also being afraid to say, I don't know. A lot of people tell me that they're afraid to say, I don't know. They feel that they have to have all the answers when we can't possibly know everything, right? Avoidance of failure. A lot of times we're, trying so hard to avoid failing, and we have to have all the answers when we're failing to recognize that, the way that we succeed is by failing. And it's actually how we progress, how we move forward. Think of a baby learning to walk. The baby gets up and falls and gets up again, and we're cheering, yay, the baby is walking, right? The baby is actually making progress, but we don't treat ourselves that way. It's also where we box ourselves into roles and labels, and that becomes our identity. And, we're also so attached to those roles and labels in terms of, our power and our privilege, that we're forgetting that we're humans. It's also someone who's always looking on the positive side. And I think, being positive is great, but if you're in an environment that's harming you, for example, or, that it's actually an environment where you don't feel free and safe to be yourself, and you tell somebody and they say, well, you should be grateful that you have a job. Both of those things are true. You can actually be grateful that you have a job, and at the same time recognize that this is actually an environment that I need to get out of. This is an environment where it's not inclusive, right? So if you're somebody who have been trained to always look on the positive side, that's another socially acceptable way that we tend to self-censor ourselves, where we don't trust ourselves and we're pretending everything is okay. Also, unhealthy productivity and busyness. And this is, we've seen in the last 3 years, the burnout crisis, and people talking about being exhausted and always having to be on and having to do so much. And, as humans, we need rest. We need time to relax. We need time to recover. Even our phones, right? We take time to charge our phones, and we let them have their time off. But also, how do we treat ourselves, right? Do we always have to be on? Do we always have to be busy? Do we always have to be doing something? And also, how is that rewarded? And then keeping it together, right? It's like having to keep it together. Like things might feel like they're falling apart, but you have to feel that, that you have it all figured out and you know what you're doing, when sometimes that's not true. And it's also, some of you shared as well in terms of like speaking up with leadership And, you know, it's socially acceptable to not challenge leadership. It's a thing that the leaders know what's best, as opposed to, yeah, every human is bringing a different perspective and experience. And sometimes, you know, the experience that you have can be what is needed in order for the change to happen, or in order for, you know, an organization to be more inclusive, for example. And also fake harmony to avoid conflict and differences. This is where people, you know, are just trying to keep the peace versus sharing those differences, allowing for diversity of opinions and thoughts and perspectives, because that is what allows for creativity and innovation in an organization, versus like, just let's you know, not disrupt this peace, but at the same time, it's going to end up you know, causing more harm because people are not feeling safe to share, and it doesn't feel like a safe, psychologically safe environment to be able to share differing opinions. And it's also where you shrink yourself to fit professional norms. And this one is very common as well, is where we, you know, fit into that identity of what it means to be professional. And a lot of times, you know, especially if you're coming from marginalized backgrounds, that can mean discarding vital parts of your identity and even valuable experiences, so that you're meeting those norms. So I'm just going to check the chat for a second. Yeah, so Kaylee's saying, thank you so much for making the point on inclusion versus diversity. It's definitely a huge one where people you know, confuse those two things, because they think if there's diversity in staff, or there's even diversity in leadership, it necessarily means inclusion. But there are also people who, you know, they take, for example, if we talk about the patriarchy, and a lot, you know, in, say, for example, the corporate world, in order to get to the top, you adhere to those patriarchal standards. And a lot of women say that, you know, they feel like imposters. And, you know, a lot, and I see also a lot of advice being given to women on how to overcome imposter syndrome. And there was an article written, I believe it was or it was written in Harvard Business Review, and it was talking about how to stop telling women that they have imposter syndrome. It's not that they're the imposters, is that they're operating in environments where it was not designed for them, and it's not safe for them to be themselves. And that's because the organization is not inclusive. So for them to succeed, they have to take on these, you know, these traits. And it also means that they have to discard those vital parts of themselves. So for Vanessa, toxic positivity is resonating. Yeah, so Connie's saying that she feels that in a work environment, we expect to conduct ourselves in a professional manner at all times. But I think that if we feel strongly about something and want to voice our opinion, we should be able to do that. But it's a reasonable, constructive way, will not offend, but approach in a positive way. Yeah, I mean, I think in a very ideal world, that would be great, right? But unfortunately, we don't live in an ideal world. And I think even what I'm suggesting is that when we think of what does it mean to operate in a professional manner, that's exactly what we have to question, what it means to be professional, right? And who designed those standards and who are they designed for, right? Because that's what we want to start to look at, to see in a deeper way, why is it that a lot of people feel that they can be authentic in their career? So in what ways do you self-censor or not share your full diversity as a matter of self-protection because it doesn't feel safe to do so within an organization or professional realm? Yeah, thank you. That's the area. Yeah, certainly. I mean, we can talk about the patriarchy as a system. We can talk about white supremacy. We can talk about patriarchy as systems. Those are just two of the dehumanizing systems. Yeah, so Janet is sharing a definition that she came up with. And also, where does that definition come from? Right. And that is what that's what we're looking at in this session as well. Like, where does that definition come from? And how does that also make you feel that you can't be authentic if you're operating based on those standards, right? It's about being industrious and organized, right? Think of people who perhaps don't necessarily fit into that definition. Like somebody who, for example, has ADHD, or somebody who is, needs, maybe they have, a condition where they can't be on all the time. Does it fit with, does that allow them to be themselves? Well, thank you for sharing that, Janet. So in what ways do you find yourself self-censoring and not sharing your full diversity as a matter of self-protection because it doesn't feel safe to do so within an organization or professional realm? So Kathy's saying, I feel I have to censor that I self-identify as someone who lies on the spectrum. Yeah, albeit the high-functioning, brilliant, the brilliant end, yeah. I'm very often afraid to say I don't know because I think I will be viewed as incompetent. Yeah, that's a big one, right? To feel that we always have to know. And how dehumanizing that is to everyone, right? Not always speaking up. I self-censor sometimes by how I dress. I self-censor by being more hyper-aware of my tone and how I present. Also by not speaking up when I think something isn't right. I'm afraid that people won't understand my jokes and not sharing those jokes. And think of all the people who don't get to enjoy that because you don't share, right? Raymond, not all companies are accepting of folks that are neurodiverse. Yeah, 100%, Raymond. Fear of being ridiculed for sounding different. Yeah. I censor myself from talking about any personal issues because I'm afraid I will be judged. Yeah, totally feel that, Jiyong. Yeah, and all of these experiences are real. Like I can also relate to many of them. Exactly. Last time I mentioned something personal in my interview, it backfired. Yeah, and I also, Ashish, I want you to consider this, that if you're showing up to an interview and you're being honest and you're sharing, from a space of like really, representing who you are, and that organization says, well, you don't get the job, that's okay, right? Because why would you want to work in an organization where you're not safe to be yourself, right? So it's not, the problem is not that you shared something personal. The problem is that, that organization, it's like you're expecting, that when you share that everybody's going to be accepting. And remember, I said authenticity doesn't mean everybody is going to like you, right? And also that's a great thing that you want to weed out those people who are not going to accept you as you are. Yeah, so I don't share personal life issues with others because of trust issues. And also, yeah, Connie, thank you for sharing that. And we don't also share, everything personal about ourselves with everyone, because that's not necessarily authentic as well, right? But it is, if you're just holding back and hiding, like if I share this with somebody, they're going to reject me. That's when, you want to start looking at it. Yeah. Yeah, so Jan is saying my biggest challenge is to build authentic relationship. It requires to show up authentically. It can backfire for sure, but isn't there a greater benefit if it turns out well? Yeah, so often what we do in our career is that we look at what is this, like, instead of looking at it in terms of what will it cost me, right? What is the bad thing that will happen if I show up authentically? Looking at what is it costing me if I don't show up authentically, right? What is it costing me if I don't show up authentically? So what does it cost you if you don't show up authentically in your career? Because oftentimes what we're doing is looking at what we stand to lose, right? And again, this is us in our survival mode. We're looking at what is it, if I say this, that person is not going to like me, versus, then if I say it, actually, if I don't say it, the people who will resonate with what I say, they're not going to be able to see me. So Ashish is saying it's a bit ironic because the question was asked by the interviewer in the first place. I might have gotten carried away with my responses. And also, I want you to notice, Ashish, how you're going into, making yourself wrong. Like I might have gotten carried away with my responses, right? And that's usually the first place that we go. We go into blaming and shaming ourselves. And that's where we make ourselves wrong. And we think we have to fix ourselves because we're doing something wrong. You were just being human, right? Yeah, so Raymond is saying sometimes bad things are a blessing in disguise, right? So if we actually were to take the 30,000 feet view, it's actually not a bad thing. It was something that that served us in terms of that not working out the way that we wanted to. And Ashish is saying, yeah, it's being self-critical. And notice, why is it that you're self-critical? What are the standards by which you're measuring yourself against? Because that's really important, to have that recognition, because otherwise what we're doing is being very unconscious, being very unaware, as opposed to being aware in terms of, okay, so there's systems that exist, and me in the system, I understand, that there are parts of me that, based on the standards of the system, these are not safe. It's not safe for me to show up in that way, but it's not where you're making those parts wrong. It's where you're understanding, right? It's like, and there's a story someone that I was listening to, that someone was saying, it's like these two fish, they're swimming in water, right? So they're swimming in the water, and one fish turns to the other fish and it says, hey, how do you like the water today? And the other fish says, what's water? A lot of times we don't even realize that we're operating based on these norms and systems, right? We're in the water. We were born into the water. We never consented to being in that water, but we don't ever even recognize that it's a thing, right? We were born into these systems. We were, were conditioned and programmed to operate based on these systems, and we never ever questioned there's a different way of operating. And that's where we're starting to recognize, like, okay, so that exists, right? So professionalism standards stifle diversity and are not inclusive, right? Because often what we're doing based on professionalism standards is moving towards sameness and uniformity, right? And we know humans are very diverse creatures, right? So how does this happen? Because it centers dominant culture as a standard for professionalism. So right now in the US, standards of professionalism are based on the white patriarchy, right? And it means fitting in rather than adding to. So when you're going to an organization, oftentimes, people who are looking to interview, it's like, make sure you're the right fit. So somebody who is interviewing you, I've often hear people like hiring managers say this, like, I choose the person who I see myself having lunch with, or I choose the person who I see myself spending 8 hours with. That means they're choosing somebody who, feels like themselves. And it doesn't allow for the diversity, and it doesn't allow for, for an environment that's inclusive of people who are different. And this is where it becomes a matter of control and subjugation by requiring humans to fit in rather than coming in to add to, right? And when we're looking at professionalism standards, you have to operate based on these standards. We're moving towards sameness versus having room for diversity to exist. This is how we are going to be dressing in this environment. This is how we speak, right? This is how we act. And for many people, that can feel like very unsafe. Yeah, so Connie's saying, I hear that all the time at interviews, the right fit. How are you the right fit for us? Yes, and where you have to justify that. And a lot of times they can make you feel that you are wrong or there's something that you're doing wrong. It also creates an oppressive experience for marginalized groups, right? For example, dress, hair, language. I shared with you some of these examples in terms of how people, didn't feel that they could show up as themselves. And I hear a lot when I talk to Black women and they talk about their hair and what it means in in terms of being professional, where if they were to show up to an interview in their natural hair, that didn't feel safe and that they wouldn't get the job. It also polices emotions which are not considered professional. So some of the emotions, what are some emotions which are not considered professional? I think I talked about some of them, but what are some of the emotions which are not considered professional? Anger. Do you think anger has a purpose? What do you think is the purpose of anger? Anger is usually there when there's an injustice happening, or when there's, it's like if a boundary is being violated, it's natural to feel angry. That's a real emotion. Like, I'm angry. It doesn't mean that you have to lash out at somebody, but it can be like, right now I'm feeling angry because, I was planning to leave work at 5 p.m. and at, 3 p.m. you're giving me this project that's going to cause me to be here all night when I have dinner plans with my family. That is a justified emotion in that moment, right? And we've been taught that, that's not it's not professional to be angry. So that's something that we also need to look at, like how do these systems and how do these standards police emotions so that we're again fitting in, right, where we have to discard and parts of ourselves and where we're not trusting ourselves anymore, because if I voice that anger, what's going to be the consequence of that, right? It's professionalism standards also promote inauthenticity in terms of placing greater value on degrees and certifications and achievements and all of these things. But what about other, life experiences, struggles, challenges, everything that allow us to actually show up in a really valuable way, right? Somebody may not have those degrees, or they may not have those fancy awards, but they actually have a lot of value that they can give. And if we're just judging people based on the degrees and certificates and all of that, then we're discarding so much value in terms of if that's how we're seeing some humans as better than others. And that's where it becomes very dehumanizing, because whenever we put somebody on a pedestal, it means that we have to be below the pedestal. And that itself is humanizing, to put someone on a pedestal, to say that there's something other than humans. And we do this often with leaders in an organization, where we make them something other than humans. And we act, the way we interact with them, it becomes very dehumanizing, because we're placing, and outsourcing so much power to them. And we're not seeing each other as humans, and we're not communicating as humans. So also recognizing, if you're doing this in the career process, whether it's in the interview or networking or at work, and you're putting somebody on a pedestal, it's also dehumanizing to the other person. So Connie's asking, how would you use life struggles and challenges you experience to convey your value to an organization? That's a great question, Connie. So I can share from my own experiences, right? So take, for example, Baruch College, where I worked for many years as a career coach. And how did I use that, to showcase the value that I can bring? I was a student once at Baruch, right? And actually, I did everything that I was supposed to do. I graduated with a high GPA, and so all the achievements part. But where I struggled was in terms of choosing a career path. I ended up choosing finance because everybody told me, okay, so you go work on Wall Street, and that's where you're going to, that's where you're going to be successful. And me being an immigrant and not having much knowledge in terms of the different paths that I could choose, I went and worked in finance. And it was a struggle for me in terms of, figuring out my place, because even though I had done everything right, I didn't feel like I belong. And I felt like there was a problem with me where I felt like an imposter. And, it was a journey to figuring out what it is that I really wanted to do. And, understanding, even being a woman, how it led to feeling like an imposter, how being an immigrant led me to, feeling that my accent wasn't good enough, and being able to share from that experience in terms of how I can help students at Baruch, especially students who were coming from marginalized backgrounds, to be able to, to approach their career in a far more conscious way and through a systems lens. So that's how you can, and that's also how I differentiated myself from everyone else, as opposed to just saying, oh, I have this coaching certification, which everybody else has. It was, I was able to differentiate myself. So Kathy's saying, I formerly worked for a premier global company where all the executives except the founder were on a first name basis. I thought that was great. And it made everyone feel valued regardless of position. Excellent. Yeah. So we all have our own personal stories and we have our own struggles, each of us in here. And it's important to acknowledge that as part of your value as well. So let's talk about some of the consequences of dehumanizing standards at work. It's the shame and feeling of not good enough, right? If you're in a space where those standards, where you feel you can't live up to those standards or that's not who you are, it can, it can trigger feelings of not being good enough. And this is where we think there's something wrong with us, right? It's the exhaustion from being in performance mode. Many of you might have heard the term code switching. Code switching is where, you come to work and you have to act a certain way, in the quote unquote professional way. And then at the end of the day, that's when you let go of that. And that can be exhausting because it's not who you are. It also can lead to feeling trapped and not control in your career, especially if you feel that you're not free and you have to give up your freedom. This is where it can feel like you're trapped and you're stuck and all of that. It can lead to a lack of meaning and purpose, right? And it's not because it's not because the meaning is missing. It's because there are parts of you that's missing because you're not bringing, your full self. It also means that you're going through the motions to get and keep a job. You're doing the things that you're supposed to, right? You're just doing them, day after day and going through those motions rather than being very intentional and conscious. It also can lead to black or white thinking, right? So black or white thinking is where you believe that your options are basically survive or die, right? It's where you feel like, if you leave this job, you don't know how you're going to be able to make it versus seeing all the options that are available to you and making those choices. It can lead to feelings of anxiety, right? It can feel like, where you don't know, like you don't know how you're going to figure this out. It's like, you don't know why it feels this way. You've done everything that you were supposed to do. It can also lead to feelings of learned helplessness. And learned helplessness is where basically you're giving your agency over to an organization. And it's where you're just basically saying, like, you take care of my needs, and where you feel that, you are not able to take care of your needs, when in fact, the value that you're providing to the organization is what's allowing you to take care of your needs. And that value can be transferred to many different places. And you can also find a place where it's safe and it's free. You can feel free to be yourself. It also leads to second guessing yourself in terms of, if you know that you want to move towards or move in a certain direction in your career, you're questioning whether that's right or whether you should do that because you don't trust yourself. It also leads to people pleasing and lack of boundaries, where you're, getting caught up in saying yes to things because you're afraid that, if you were to actually have boundaries, that, that the consequences could be dire. Imposter syndrome, we talk about that, where you feel, like a fraud in the environment. You feel like if they find out, they're going to see that you don't really belong there. And it's also being afraid to express yourself fully, where you're not sharing in meetings and, because you also don't feel safe to be yourself. And if you're not aware of the systems at play, this gets internalized as something being wrong with you right? Where you make it your problem. And how do you deal with this? So it's actually, I like this process, the learning growth process, a lot, because it's moving from unconscious incompetence to unconscious competence. So unconscious incompetence is where you don't know what you don't know, right? It's the fish in water, doesn't know what water is, right? So if you're unaware, for example, of systems and how the way that you're operating in relation to those systems, and you think this is just, the way that I'm supposed to be, you don't know what you don't know. But then once you start being aware of those systems, that's when you move into conscious incompetence. Okay, so the reason that I'm not able to be authentic right now is because of these systems, but how do I start to learn to trust myself and all of that, right? And this can actually feel really uncomfortable when you start moving into the conscious competence part of it, where you're putting this into practice, where you're slowly learning to trust yourself. Okay, what is it that I'm moving towards versus, am I operating based on fear and trying to run away from a bad situation? And then as you practice this more and more, and you recognize, okay, so systems are there, and rather than survive in systems, I can actually thrive by being myself. And what would that look like? Then you start learning to trust yourself more and more. And this becomes unconscious competence, where it becomes more second nature, right? So a lot of people don't get to this point. It becomes where it's like in that conscious competence, because, it's where your unconscious competence is just where you're, naturally going out, being yourself fully. But, there are always things that are going to make you question yourself, but it's also to have that awareness of systems. So what does it mean to survive versus thrive in your career? Let's talk about psychological safety first. Psychological safety at work doesn't mean that everybody's nice to each other all the time. It means that people feel free to brainstorm out loud, voice half-finished thoughts, openly challenge the status quo, share feedback, and work through disagreements together, right? So it doesn't mean that we're always going to be nice to each other, but it means that the environment is safe where we can do that, and it doesn't lead to to somebody getting fired because they spoke up, right? And it means that you're not afraid to speak up, you're not afraid to be human, you're not afraid to bring who you are to these discussions. And there's this quote that I really love. It says, when a flower doesn't bloom, you fix the environment in which it grows, not the flower, right? When a flower doesn't bloom, you fix the environment in which it grows, not the flower. Unfortunately, we're often doing the opposite. We're trying to fix the flower to fit the environment, right? And this requires really understanding yourself, knowing yourself, right? And understanding the systems in which you're operating. And that could cause you to feel that you can't be authentic. So dealing with fears. Dehumanizing systems perpetuate the ideas that failure, rejection, and uncertainty are unsafe, right? That failure is unsafe, rejection is unsafe, uncertainty, that's unsafe. And then when those things are actually human and they're necessary for your growth. So how do you deal with your fears? First of all, recognize that failure is required in order to succeed. What do I mean by this? Michael Jordan has a quote, and he says, the reason that I'm so successful as a basketball player is because I failed more than anyone else. You can choose to see it as failure, or you can choose to see it as progress, right? And a lot of times we feel that it's not safe to fail because this is part of our programming. So how do you deal with fear? It's to have a new way, have a reframe in terms of how you're looking at it. Rejection is the same thing. A lot of people are afraid of being rejected, right? And to recognize that rejection is just a part of life. Regardless of what path you choose, you are going to face, there are people who are not going to like you, there are people who are going to say no to you, and to recognize that it's part of life. So rather than trying to avoid rejection, move in a direction that you want and accept that this is going to be a part of the process, right? And then there's the fear of the unknown. And this is often where we're mistaking familiarity with safety. We're trying to hold on to the known, thinking that is safety. And what we're not doing is placing that trust in ourselves, right? Because if we can place that trust in ourselves, that's where we have that unshakable knowing that, okay, so no matter what happens, I trust myself that I'm going to be able to recover. Even if I fail, I trust that I can recover from this. Even if I get rejected, I trust that I can recover from this, right? So it's to be able to recognize that failure, rejection, uncertainty, they're part of the process. They're part of being human, right? The messiness of being human. And that rather than trying to avoid those things, that's how you make decisions that allow you to, move away from your authenticity, to start to integrate that as part of the experience of life and experience of being human. So embracing your authenticity, it means becoming aware of dehumanizing systems in place and how they limit you and everyone else. Even the people who those systems are meant to benefit, they limit them because it's dehumanizing. It means that they can't be fully human. They can't have their emotions. They can't bring parts of themselves, the messiness and all of that. So it's dehumanizing to everyone. Learn to value and trust yourself despite your fears. That fear is going to show up, right? It doesn't mean that you shouldn't do it. It means that you actually recognize, okay, so if I trusted myself, what is it that I would do? It means that you also work on undoing the deep societal conditioning rather than constantly fixing yourself and thinking something is wrong with you. It means also that you choose work environments where you get to add to rather than merely fit in, and that you're discarding parts of yourself and shrinking who you are and censoring yourself to fit in. It also means that you embrace discomfort as part of the growth process, right? Discomfort doesn't mean it's bad. Think of a caterpillar transforming into a butterfly. That process is not comfortable, but it's what's needed in order to grow. So as part of growth, you're going to have to deal with discomfort. Be in community with people where it's safe to be yourself. Like, this is a great community, right? Where it's safe to be yourself, where people are not going to judge you, for having an opinion. It's like where it's safe to be yourself. Engage in self-care by processing your emotions, right? What are the emotions that are coming up? Is it fear? Is it anger? Is it sadness? What is the emotion that's coming up? Being able to process those emotions and setting boundaries, right? What are the boundaries that you need to set? And then advocating for yourself, making sure that you're advocating for yourself. What is it that you need? Where is it that you want to move towards, and taking those steps, reclaiming your agency. Don't be surprised by disappointment. I talk to so many people who they're afraid of disappointment, right? As opposed to expecting it. Again, it's part of life, and they're trying to avoid disappointment. Again, playing not to lose versus playing to win. I think Janet was saying that earlier in terms of like, if I don't do this thing, what is it going to cost me versus what is it that I'm going to lose? And staying focused on where you're going without letting fear stop you. It means that you're moving towards what it is that you want and not away from what you don't want. And what I want to say is that authenticity is hard. Nobody says this is easy, right? Especially when you're operating in systems that tell you that you have to be someone other than you are. Inauthenticity is also hard. And this is where you get to choose what is it that you want to, which one is worth it to you, right? And inauthenticity usually happens when we're going through the motions and not in a space of awareness. When we're being authentic, it means that we're aware. We're aware that there are consequences as well to being authentic, but we're willing to, to deal with those consequences because it's worth it to us, right? And you also have to decide, what is it that you want in your career? Is it privilege or is it freedom that you want? What is more important to you? And again, when I say privilege, I mean privilege in a system, in a dehumanizing system. And this is where we're also complicit in perpetuating those systems when we, including me, when we're playing into that, right? And this is a lot of times, I would hear like a lot of people come and they get very disturbed, when there are trainings on racism or sexism, and people would say like, I'm not a racist or I'm not a sexist. But in fact, when we look at it from the perspective, not of that I hate a certain race of people, but that I'm upholding systems that's dehumanizing, to certain races, that's also where we're complicit in terms of those systems existing. They need us to be part of it and to feed that machinery for them to exist. And there, in systems, there are people who are privileged and there are people who are marginalized. Or freedom, where you get that freedom to be yourself, right? Where you have to do that work to increase your own awareness and accept yourself as fully human, right? It's an accepting yourself as fully human that you can be free. Because if you're okay to be human, okay to be messy, okay to fail, okay to be rejected, okay to not know all the answers, what would you do in your career, right? And that's what it means to be truly free. And you can't wait for somebody to give you that freedom, right? That's not nobody else's responsibility. So thank you so much. And as I said, here's my email address. I do have a few slots open if you want to have a career where you can be yourself and where you don't have to self-censor and where you don't have to fit in. Feel free to reach out. You can also connect with me on LinkedIn, and I have a newsletter where I share resources and events if you want to get on that list. And thank you so much for being here tonight.
Thank you very much. And really a fantastic presentation. I really enjoyed that. Thank you to all of our alumni who joined us as well. We'll try to tackle a couple of follow-up questions and comments, but before doing so, I did want to put in the chat LinkedIn addresses for myself and Tanuja. Tanuja has it there on the screen as well. Feel free to reach out. I also wanted to advertise our next event coming up March 23rd. It's going to be a financial literacy webinar about an introduction to cryptocurrency. I've put the link down there. Slightly different topic than what we did today, but it will be an exploration of some basics of cryptocurrency for our financial literacy series. And thank you again to all of our alumni for being here. We will send a recording out afterwards, so be on the lookout for that. Now, Tanuja, I'll open it up for a few more questions before we wrap up. I know we've been on here for quite a while, so only a few questions and comments really, but if anyone would like to put in some questions in the chat, have some questions, Tanuja, feel free to tackle.
Yeah, Jaeyoung?
Hi.
Hi.
I guess my question was kind of like, I think the thing that I struggle with the most is that like, I'm never sure how much personal information I should be sharing in terms of like, because you want to get close. I feel like I want to get close to my coworkers because we work with them every single day, but then sometimes I feel like I have to censor myself a lot because like, what if I say this and then they think this about me? But like, it's such a fine line. And I don't know where the fine line of professionalism is when it comes to like sharing your true self and like your true personal experiences and trying to like bond with somebody, or just like staying professional and just make it about work.
What are you afraid of?
I just like, I've been known to like overshare in the past where like I've told like, just like personal information, like let's say it was about like a past relationship or something, or like, I don't know, like past work history or something like that. And then somehow it gets like, maybe it's backfired a few times. Like not truly, but just like maybe that was why they thought that about me, or like, wait, maybe that's why I don't get as much respect or seem to get as much respect as I would if I just pretended like I don't have any of those, personal experiences.
How does it feel to pretend?
I feel like I'm hiding something, like it's like, I'm gonna get caught. But then at the same time, it's like, maybe I need to hide that. Like maybe that's the smarter way to go about it.
Yeah, and totally what you're saying. I mean, I think a lot of people in the room, right? Like feel that, but you also want to acknowledge like, what is the fear there in terms of sharing? Because there is a fear, right? Like if I share and you said it backfired on me, right? And it's where you go back into that self-censoring and you're blaming yourself, right? It's like I overshared.
Right.
But what if it was that person would have responded that way anyway? That person, it was not a safe space for you to share, right? In the times that you did share, because you could have shared with somebody else the same thing that you shared, and it would have been, oh wow, thank you for sharing that with me.
Right.
But what you're doing is that you're making yourself wrong, first of all, for the experience that you had, and then what you on top of that, you're self-censoring. Right? So wanting to share, wanting to connect with them, but also not, because I mean, I trust that you know that you're not going to, like you're not going to be talking to somebody for the first time and just sharing like deeply personal information. I'm feeling what you're wanting to share, like, some information that will allow you to get them to, or get to know them at beyond the surface level.
Yeah. It's kind of like, do you make friends at work? Like, is it just like, I come here for work, not to make friends kind of thing? Or is it like, and then also like, does it sometimes make them respect you a little bit less as like a superior, let's say it's like a person who's actually like reporting to you. It's like, does that make them see you more as like a friend than like as their not superior? Oh God, this is
but how about them seeing you as a human, as opposed to them seeing you as a friend or a colleague or all of that? How about seeing each other as humans?
Right.
At the end of the day, because when we get caught up in those labels, that's when, the relationship becomes a problem. But if you're communicating to somebody human to human, how would you communicate with them?
Yeah.
And this is why also when it comes to like leadership and managers and all of that, we get very, this is where we get very carried away in terms of like, what are the rules of engagement and where are we going to find those rules and all of that, right? And this is when we come back into those dehumanizing systems where we're not really authentically connecting with anyone. We're just people pleasing and trying to get liked by people, but it also means that people are not liking us for who we truly are. They're liking us for this version that we're showing up with them.
Yeah.
And if you were to show up truly as yourself, that's when your people are going to want to connect with you.
Great. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Tanuja, there's a question in the chat here that says, should we operate on the assumption that our colleagues are also interested in being their authentic self at work?
Yeah, I mean, I believe everybody wants to be their authentic self at work, but we've also been conditioned to not be authentic. I would say that the career process itself, right, is dehumanizing in terms of how we're trained to operate in the career process. So I believe everybody, this is something in terms of like questioning yourself and should I say this or should I not say this? But I think ultimately what we all want is to be free, right? I think every single human wants to be free. And for me, like when I work with clients is how do you get paid to be yourself, right? How do you get paid to, to when you're showing up as yourself and the value that you can add when you're yourself? And I believe everybody wants that, but we've been conditioned to operate in career from a way of surviving. And that is why we keep we keep self-censoring and not be authentic.
We have gone a bit over, and I do want to mention that we definitely hope to do more webinars with Tanuja in the future. Tanuja also has to book a consultation call to reach out to her on Gmail. So definitely take advantage of that. And I want to thank again all of our alumni who participated this evening and for your engagement. Really enjoyed everyone's questions and engagement. Thank you, Tanuja, so much. Really enjoyed this presentation, always fascinating. And I'd like to just give Tanuja a virtual round of applause here.
Oh, thank you.
Presentation.
Yeah,
Thank
you can take
much.
A photo of this slide as well. And, if you want to, and we'll, look forward to connecting.
And again, we will share the recording of this afterwards. So be on the lookout for that. And I want to thank everybody again for their participation this evening. Thank you, everyone. We hope to see you soon. And I hope you have a great rest of your evening. Thank you again, everyone.
Thank you. Take care.
Take care.